Well, what I will say to the previous speaker is that all of us have food banks in our constituency. We don't really need to visit his because we're perfectly well aware of the requirement for them. But the requirement for them is not because people don't know how to cook. It's because we have poverty in this country at a scale that should shame his government. Now, before I address the substance of today's debate, Mr Deputy Speaker, and in particular the government's plans for a British Bill of Rights, like others, I'd like to refer to the results of the local elections last week, because in Scotland they were a very important reminder that this British government has no mandate in Scotland and no mandate for any of the policies it's seeking to impose on Scotland in the programme for government. And it's really no surprise, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Conservatives lost so many votes and have been reduced to third place in Scotland. When I was campaigning on the doorsteps of Edinburgh South West, I heard over and over again the contempt in which this UK government is held. And it's not just the endemic law-breaking, it's the rank lack of respect for the frequently expressed views of the Scottish electorate for a different way of doing things and for a second independence referendum, given the broken promises of the first. And Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm particularly proud that in my own constituency of Edinburgh South West, in the Pentlands Hill ward, my colleague and friend Fiona Glasgow displaced a Tory councillor to win yet another seat for the SNP on the City of Edinburgh Council. And I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate her for the fantastic campaign that she ran. It's always good, Mr Deputy Speaker, to see women of independent mind elected to public office. Now, it was suggested by the leader of Her Majesty's opposition yesterday that this Queen's speech has no guiding principle. And he's right, insofar as it abjectly fails to make meaningful proposals for reversing the cost of living crisis. And that cost of living crisis is really hammering my constituents as well as constituents across the United Kingdom. There's nothing in this speech about cutting VAT on fuel bills. There's nothing about taxing big companies, not just the energy companies, but other companies with excess profits. There's nothing to increase benefits, and there's nothing to reinstate the £20 that was cut from universal credit. Instead, I heard on the radio this morning that the Cabinet met yesterday to chuck around ideas to deal with the cost of living crisis, but didn't come to any conclusions. Mr Deputy Speaker, the lack of urgency and the lack of focus of this government is as insulting to my constituents as it is callous. Nor does this Queen's speech contain any measures to compensate my constituents for the serial incompetence of the Home Office, not just in respect of the handling of immigration and asylum cases, but also now the issuing of passports. Lots of working-class families in my constituency have lost out on hard-worked-for holidays, and it's an absolute disgrace, and I'd like to know if the government's going to compensate them. Mr Speaker, I might not agree with everything the Leader of Her Majesty's opposition says. We disagree on the right of Scotland to self-determination, and I'd like to see him do more to stick up for women's sex-based rights and the rights of same-sex attracted people. But I do consider the Leader of the opposition to be a man of integrity. And I don't want to live in a state, Mr Deputy Speaker, where the government, with the assistance of their little helpers in the right-wing press, are able to influence the police to reopen a closed investigation into their political enemies. It stinks. And most of my constituents can see the difference between what seems to have been a working meal and the endless parade of parties with suitcases of booze and karaoke that took place at Number 10 during lockdown. People are not stupid. Yesterday, we were told in the Queen's speech that this government is going to ensure the Constitution is upheld. I have to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, I had to struggle to stop myself from laughing out loud. This Prime Minister can't even uphold the ordinary laws of the land. And in 2019, he rode roughshod over the Constitution when he unlawfully prorogued Parliament. And that was just the start of it. In 2020, his government introduced legislation designed to go back on an agreement they themselves had signed with the European Union. And now they're still at it with the Northern Ireland Protocol. Mr Deputy Speaker, I think there is a guiding principle of this Queen's speech, and I think it's this. It's to diminish the ability of this Parliament and the courts to hold this government to account. And we see it in the Bill of Rights, we see it in the Public Order Bill, and we also see it in the Brexit Freedoms Bill, which is going to expand executive power to amend, appeal or replace EU retained law by way of secondary legislation, so this House can't scrutinise it properly. So much for taking back control. Now, on the Bill of Rights, Mr Deputy Speaker, as has already been said by my honourable friend, the Government's independent review on the Human Rights Act and the Cross-Party Joint Committee of Human Rights, of which I'm a member, have found that the case for replacing the Human Rights Act with the British Bill of Rights has not been made out. The independent review suggested only very minor changes to the Human Rights Act, noting that the vast majority of submissions to that review spoke strongly in support of our Human Rights Act. But this government didn't even bother to address the findings of their own independent review and instead published their own consultation on the same day that the independent review reported. It's really quite extraordinary. And yesterday, the Right Honourable Member for Halton, Price and Howden, who's not in his place and for whom I have a great deal of respect, but I disagree with him on this issue, he tried to suggest that the main reason for modifying the Human Rights Act is that it will give the government the ability to deport foreign criminals who've been released from prison. Well, in our recent and very thorough report on human rights reform dated 13th April, the Joint Committee of Human Rights examined that claim in some detail, and we found it to be unsubstantiated by the data produced by the government. And for anyone who's interested, those arguments are set out at paragraphs 223 to 234 of our report. We also found that the government's case that human rights legislation is in serious need of reform is not proven. This is not evidence-based policy making, and we concluded that the government's purporting to solve non-existent problems and offering solutions that will only cause confusion and detriment to those who need their rights protected. We said that if the government really wanted to strengthen human rights, they would improve how they are respected in general and improve education so that everyone knows their rights and improve access to the courts for those needing to enforce them. Improving awareness and understanding of human rights and access to the courts would have a far more beneficial impact than the government's current proposals. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, that's a cross-party report and it was unanimous, so the government should listen to it. And they should also listen to the conclusions of the independent review that they themselves commissioned. Now, of course, there's a particular Scottish angle to reform of the Human Rights Act, and this has been highlighted in a previous report of the Joint Committee of Human Rights, where we recommended that any proposals to reform the Human Rights Act should not be pursued without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. Again, that was the recommendation of a cross-party committee, and it's in tune with the position of the Scottish Government. Now, the Human Rights Act itself is a reserved matter, but human rights per se in Scotland are not reserved. And we have our own Scottish Human Rights Commission, A-listed by the United Nations, which is very concerned about the government's plans to replace the Human Rights Act with the Bill of Rights. And indeed, the Joint Committee of Human Rights is taking further evidence about that this afternoon. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Human Rights Act, which we already have in this country, is in fact a Bill of Rights. And there's two characteristics of a Bill of Rights. First of all, that they're universal. The rights apply to everyone, not just the people who the government find it convenient to give rights to. And secondly, that it's a higher law. And that's why we have the Section 3 interpretive obligation in the Human Rights Act as it stands. And if you take these things out, as the government's proposing to do, then it's not, in fact, actually a Bill of Rights. Now, everyone knows that the Tories, or some of them at least, have been wanting to get us out of the European Convention of Human Rights for some years. But the reality is, those same Tories, they're cheering now, but your leader, their leader, Mr Deputy Speaker, signed an agreement with the European Union when we left, which means we can't leave the ECHR. So actually, this British Bill of Rights idea is just a sneaky little way to try and diminish people's ability to enforce their rights under the ECHR. Now, nobody else so far this afternoon has mentioned the plans for a ban on LGB conversion therapy. And I'd like to say that I support that ban, although I do think the evidence for how much it's a contemporary problem is questionable, but it was certainly a very serious problem in the past. I'm just going to develop my argument before I give way. However, I'm concerned that honourable members are coming under pressure to support a ban on what's described as trans conversion therapy, which ignores the interim report of the CAS review and the testimonies of Tavistock Clinic whistleblowers and detransitioners. Now, there's an exponential rise in the number of girls seeking to transition, Mr Deputy Speaker, and many of these girls will be same-sex attracted. And it's important that this possibility and other explanations for gender dysphoria, such as autism, are able to be explored in a respectful way with a qualified therapist before young women embark on a road to medicalisation. Experiencing gender dysphoria in childhood or puberty doesn't necessarily mean that you are trans. Thousands of adult lesbians and gay men like myself will know this to be true. And I think it's really important that honourable members understand that trans-inclusive means assuming all children who say that they are the opposite sex are transgender. And it also means insisting they don't need psychotherapy if they say they don't want it. And Hilary Cass, former president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, has been commissioned to report on NHS gender identity services for children. And her interim report, published a couple of months ago, has provided worrying information about the lack of normal clinical standards being applied to children with gender distress. More work needs to be done, but the interim results show a high proportion of cared-for children, those with autism or experience of abuse, and children who would be likely to grow up as lesbian or gay, presenting for gender services. So I'm advocating for evidence-based policy making. Let's wait for the outcome of the CAS report, and let's not be influenced by those who want to criminalise therapists who simply want to do their job and act in their patients' best interests. We urgently need proper informed debate in public and in Parliament, and this must centre on the well-being of children and young people. Now, we can only have those sort of debates in this place and beyond if we have free speech. The Tories say they believe in free speech and they want to better protect it as a right. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, actions speak louder than words. The Police Act passed in the last session, the Public Order Bill and the Online Safety Bill all contain potential threats to freedom of expression. And one of the problems with the Online Safety Bill is the introduction of a legal but harmful category for the removal of content. And this will create a situation in which people will be prevented from saying things that are legal but prohibited. And there's a really significant danger that the bill as drafted will lead to censorship of legal speech by online platforms, and that it will give the government unacceptable controls over what we can and cannot say online. Now, as a former sex crimes prosecutor, I completely applaud the desire to protect children online, which underlines the Online Safety Bill. But I'm very worried that this category of legal but harmful will enable vexatious complainants to exploit that lack of definitional clarity to try and shut down lawful speech on topics of public concern that are harmful and should be subject to censorship. I don't know, the honourable gentleman over there wanted to intervene earlier. I'll give way.
It's my lucky day, Mr Deputy Speaker. The honourable member is making a most interesting speech. Does she share my concern that the weight between primary and secondary legislation when it comes to the bill she refers to is worrying, because some of the definitions are so fundamental, such as freedom of speech, that they should be laid before this House rather than nodded through by some instrument or another, whether negative or positive procedure?
I do share that. I don't think it's safe to leave setting out definitions which will impact upon free speech to a government minister in secondary legislation, particularly not a government minister in this government. But really what I'm most worried about is the online platforms, because I don't think the online platforms can be trusted to police speech in a way that's properly cognisant of the law. Not just the law on freedom of speech, but also the law on freedom of belief and domestic anti-discrimination law. Now, I'm coming to a close very shortly, but I just want to take Twitter as an example, because this is really important. Twitter's hateful conduct policy does not include the protected characteristic of sex. And so Twitter routinely censors perfectly legitimate contributions to the public debate on women's sex-based rights, while routinely ignoring threats of violence, and worse, to women participating in the debate. And in October 2019, the Joint Committee on Human Rights published a report on democracy, freedom of expression and freedom of association, in which we noted that Twitter has omitted sex from the list of protected characteristics in its hateful conduct policy. We recommended that they should remedy this, and in May 2019, a Twitter executive promised us she would look into the issue. But nearly 3 years later, nothing has been done. And this is a very real concern for the Online Safety Bill, because when women have challenged Twitter's unfair and discriminatory moderation policies, Twitter have replied that they do not consider themselves bound by the Equality Act in relation to the services they provide in the United Kingdom. And their argument is that because they're a company established in Ireland as opposed to the UK, they're therefore exempt under paragraph 2 of Schedule 25 to the Equality Act. Now, I'm not sure that that's right, but it's a loophole that could be closed in the Online Safety Bill, and I've already had some informal discussions with ministers about closing that loophole. So, to conclude, there's no point in saying that we need a Bill of Rights to protect free speech and then handing over the policing of speech to private companies such as Twitter, whose record shows that they can't be trusted. So on free speech, this government needs to put its money where its mouth is.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it gives me